Oncology nurses are equipped with knowledge and skills to create this culture, so they can be familiar with current practices and standards of care for oncology patients and recommend changes if applicable. Oncology nurses can also participate in quality improvement projects, peer-to-peer education or re-education, and participate in applicable competencies on their unit. And oncology nurses can also do team daily huddles at the beginning of their shifts to review their schedule for the day and perhaps any potential complications or safety issues that they may anticipate and come up with a plan.
You're listening to the Oncology Nursing Podcast, where ONS Voices talk cancer, a resource from the Oncology Nursing Society. Through conversations with subject matter experts, we examine the important issues in oncology nursing, from new treatments to patient-centered research to advancements in clinical practice. Join us as we hear from nurses in all facets of oncology care, from bench to bedside and everywhere in between. Welcome to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. I'm your host, Jaime Weimer, Oncology Clinical Specialist at ONS. This is our first episode in a 3-part series focusing on creating a culture of safety. And today we're talking with Klara Culmone, Assistant Nurse Manager at NYU Langone Health in New York, New York, about the factors involved in developing and sustaining a fair and just culture. You can earn free NCPD contact hours after listening to this episode and completing the evaluation we've linked in the episode notes. Thanks so much for joining us today, Klara.
Hi, Jaime. Thank you for having me.
So to start off our conversation today, can you briefly explain the Joint Commission's cultural factors for safety?
Absolutely. So the Joint Commission describes safety culture as the product of individual and group beliefs, attitudes, perceptions, competencies, and patterns of behavior that determine the organization's commitment to quality and patient safety. So the Joint Commission really urges healthcare organizations to establish a safety culture that fosters trust in reporting unsafe conditions to ensure high-quality patient care.
Klara, can you tell us a little bit more about what a fair and just culture includes?
A fair and just culture includes encouraging and supporting people to discuss safety-related events or information with one another. This culture really includes a transparent, non-punitive approach to reporting and learning from adverse events or close calls and even unsafe conditions. The goal is to prevent and minimize events that may cause harm.
And what is an oncology nurse's role in establishing this type of fair and just culture?
Oncology nurses are critical in the establishment of this type of culture. They are leaders and often role models within their institutions. Oncology nurses understand policies, standards of care, and up-to-date evidence-based research. So being on the front lines, oncology nurses see how these 3 things can come together and directly affect our patients and also the work environment. So this global understanding positions an oncology nurse to be the liaison between patients, members of the healthcare team, and leadership.
And as you mentioned, the establishment of a fair and just culture ultimately has to start with the leadership and creating that environment. So can you talk a little bit more about the leader's role in establishing and maintaining the fair and just culture?
Yes. So key characteristics for a leader to receive support and buy-in from the team is consistency, collaboration with the team, transparency, and visibility. So our institution began its journey to becoming a high reliability organization a few years ago. And high reliability organizations, also known as HROs, work to create an environment in which problems are anticipated and detected early. So as nurse leaders, we started implementing safety huddles on our units. And every huddle follows a standardized script, which includes the following domains: introductions to the team, safety stories, unit updates, any metrics or performance improvement initiatives that we're working on, opportunities for improvement on the unit, and any staff or peer recognition.
In establishing those types of routines in this fair and just culture, what are some of the most important ways that leaders can support that and maintain that?
So the leaders really need to work in collaboration with the oncology nurses. It's important for the leader to not just follow up on issues that are brought up, for example, during a safety huddle, but also to close the loop with the staff who reported it. And this really demonstrates a commitment to solving problems. So as leaders, we make it a point to recognize and acknowledge the staff members that bring these things forward. And we plan forward and reflect back by using ad hoc huddles and debriefs with the team as needed.
I think that's so important. I know in my own experiences, both as a clinician, as a frontline nurse, but also in my leadership roles, closing that loop and making sure the communication is followed through on is so important to, as you said, establishing that trust with the team, that you're following through, that you have their back, and that you're not just hearing their concerns and sort of letting them kind of just be ignored and fall away. So that's so critical and so important. And as you mentioned, something which is relatively as simple as having a consistent way to debrief on issues or close that communication loop so that everyone on the team feels like there is a continuity and there is a resolution to any issues that were found out, and not just going into this sort of black hole void of nothingness.
Absolutely.
Can really help to further that feeling of teamwork and trust.
I couldn't agree more with you. It's really important for the nurses to see that it is being brought back to them with a follow-up or action plan.
That ultimately, I'm sure, dissuades nurses from reporting if they feel like it never goes anywhere. If it doesn't do anything, that it doesn't create an impact, or they don't feel like their concerns are heard and valued, then why would you keep reporting? So it's that continual loop of communication that reinforces the behaviors. And so again, that's something so important for leaders to do. It's, in my opinion, it's better to over communicate than under communicate. So just continuing to keep those topics or issues relevant and at the forefront until there is a decision or resolution or something that has been done to make that situation better or different is so important.
Yes, definitely. And I fully agree with the over communicate. So we have quite a large staff here. So we follow up with emails, in-person huddles, one-on-ones. We do mini group sessions. We have regularly scheduled staff meetings. So the more opportunities we have to meet with the staff, and face-to-face time is really also so important. So giving them an outlet to bring any ideas or suggestions and comments really is a great way to show commitment, as you mentioned.
So we talk a lot about the spirit of inquiry, especially when we're talking about evidence-based practice and nurses thinking about how they can do their work better. But this also includes doing their work safer. So how can they do things differently, or how can they change their processes to ensure that safety is improved? So how can institutions support oncology nurses in having that spirit of inquiry and speaking up when they see safety concerns?
In our safety huddles, we kick off with a safety story. So that is usually a near miss event, an event that reached the patient, or something that happened outside of our organization that can apply to what we do here every day. Initially, the oncology nurses on our units were a little bit skeptical of sharing safety stories. So it was, in the beginning, it was more of leadership providing examples of safety stories. It took a lot of work to get buy-in from the nurses that as leaders, we really do want to implement positive change here. And that this is one way we can accomplish that by giving the team an opportunity to bring these issues or concerns to us. And leaders do need to remind oncology nurses that providing safety stories is not punitive. It is rather a learning opportunity for everybody. So one way would be incorporating principles into practice, for example, stopping the line. So a near miss could be a nurse reviewing a chemotherapy order. They see that the dose needs to be modified. They stop the line and they question it and speak with the ordering prescriber. They realize that the patient, in fact, does need a dose modification, and the patient was able to receive the correct intended dose. So that's a great example of a near miss that we sometimes will share with our teams during the huddles. And it's really great to hear the frontline nurses speaking up and sharing their experiences with their colleagues.
I think that's a great example, and certainly akin to a debrief, after event happens. But as you mentioned, whether it's a near miss or a no harm event, but still is a learning opportunity. There's so much value and there's so much rich information in talking about those situations. And then when you consider this in just the clinical realm, especially in teaching institutions, it's very often to have, whether they're called grand rounds or M&M conferences, things like that, where you're using an actual event as an example so that everyone can learn from it and do better or do differently the next time. And so I like your example of it's not just for grand rounds or those bigger events. Usually they're once a month or once a quarter, they're not very frequent. And when it comes to safety, it should be every day. Every day there's something hopefully that you can share. Sometimes it's good. Sometimes it's a great catch and you want to make sure you shine light on those people who are identifying those things and preventing problems. But even if there are events that happen, again, if we don't share them, we can't learn from them. And so I love that example of just incorporating it into an everyday routine where it becomes part of the norm. So as we continue to support our nurses in that spirit of inquiry, speaking up, reporting things, how can that support for the nurses ultimately impact patient care and safety?
Support really should result in increased patient safety and decreased adverse events that have reached the patient. With this culture, you hope to see less of events that are reaching the patient and more of the near misses, perhaps. So we never want our patients or nurses to experience the adverse events. However, if they do happen, we do need to debrief with the team to do a deep dive into what went wrong. So oftentimes when we look into these adverse events, there is some type of procedural or operational issue that needs to be corrected or optimized. So our commitment to resilience, which is another HRO term that we use, it requires us to maintain a culture where errors are reported, addressed in real time, and used as learning opportunities to improve our systems and our daily practice.
I love that. And I think that's so important. You briefly just touched on the notion that it's routinely systems issues. It's a process issue. It's not always a personal fault. And even if it is, we're humans make mistakes. So that's something that's different and distinct from reckless behavior or doing things wrong intentionally. And so it's really important, I think, as we create this culture to help clearly define the differences. And as you mentioned, transparency, having a transparent methodology or some sort of way that each event that might happen is evaluated on that sort of scale of intention or recklessness versus process issues and larger system issues that really set that individual nurse up for a challenging environment, for failure potentially. So I think, as you mentioned, just clearly defining and separating how those terms are different, I think can help create that transparency and clarity as well.
Definitely. And I would like to just touch on real quick James Reason's Swiss cheese model. So if you think about it, you have a slice of cheese, and if you line them up, they each represent a safety barrier or precaution that's relevant to a particular hazard. So you have all these barriers that are set in place, whether it's a physical barrier like barcode scanning for medication, or a barrier where we do double nurse verification and independent checks before the patient receives chemotherapy. All of these are lined up to prevent harm to the patient and prevent an error from reaching the patient. However, not one single barrier is going to be foolproof. So each of them have holes. So that's why they call it the Swiss cheese. So in healthcare, we really need to look at these different safety steps that we have in place to prevent patient harm. So it's really important to remind oncology nurses that we report safety events so we can prevent them from happening again. So we don't look at it from a blame perspective. We look at the root cause to see how these holes lined up in the Swiss cheese for that event to occur. I know we talked about this. Most times when the event reaches a patient, it's not just one error that led up to it, but rather a series of them.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned that Swiss cheese model. Are there other steps that institutions or leaders can take to empower oncology nurses to report safety events?
Definitely. So there should be internal reporting systems that are available for staff to report whether it's an unsafe condition or a near miss event. So there should be some type of electronic reporting system for staff members. In addition, there should be policies and procedures in place that nurses can reference if they are unsure about how to proceed with something. But I do also need to emphasize that leaders do need to support this questioning attitude from oncology nurses. They should stop and resolve using thoughtful two-way questioning. So we really encourage nurses to report anything that doesn't seem right so we can work together to ensure patient safety.
As you mentioned, there are a lot of structural, environmental things that can be set up to help facilitate and make it easier and more convenient to make those reports. If you have to go fill out a 10-page form, no one's going to do that. So it needs to be something that's feasible in the work environment. But I think it can't be overstated how important having and establishing a baseline environment of the psychological safety that staff have to feel that it's safe to follow those steps and do that reporting. That has to come first, or as we know, nurses won't speak up because if they don't feel like they're safe and they're protected in providing that feedback and raising these concerns, or if they feel like no one's going to care anyways, both of those I think are detrimental to the process and kind of makes it impossible from the very beginning. And I think especially when we think about the context of how so many nurses are feeling burnt out in the environment that staffing and morale is right now in nursing across the country, it just does lead you to think, well, how is that impacting that feeling of safety, that feeling of being supported, and then ultimately patient safety? It's a challenging time in nursing right now. I think this conversation is especially timely.
Absolutely. It's so important for nurses to feel support from all aspects of care. So not just in their own confidence to do their day-to-day practice, but also from their leadership. So while there are systems in place physically and policies and such, it's really critical for a nurse leader to just show their support and say to them, listen, if there's something you're not sure about, just let's talk about it first. Let's figure out a plan, and then we'll take the next steps. Because I think sometimes just that talking about it first before following up with an action item of reporting it in an electronic system or going to the doctor, it's really great to show that you support, as a leader, that you support the nurses in their day-to-day practice.
Absolutely. And I think we could take this whole podcast in a direction just about leadership. But I think, that leader, if they're able to demonstrate their own vulnerability, if they have questions, if they're able to say, I don't know, let's find out, like that type of behavior, and providing that as an example of, I am sometimes not sure, or I sometimes have concerns and I'm able to voice them. I think that just provides that great example for the staff to look to and say, well, if she's comfortable, he or she is comfortable enough saying that out loud in front of the whole group, then I feel like I can do that too. So I think that just feeds into that culture and that safety that ultimately leads to better reporting.
Right. And if you show that you're working as a team rather than just the nurse leader telling the nurses what needs to be done, that shows a commitment that we're all here to improve things.
So when we take all of these systems in place, creating that psychological safety, how do these different tools create that just culture environment?
Through these different interventions and models of behavior, you do start to see the culture shift on a unit to a fair and just culture. So while we started our high reliability journey at our organization several years ago, I routinely have staff, so not just the oncology nurses, but other members of the healthcare team and even patients tell me about how HRO principles have positively impacted their confidence in practice, their confidence in the healthcare workers taking care of them, and also making a difference to improve processes. So we shifted the mindset from what it used to be, well, we've always done things this way. The mindset is now, well, I see that there's a problem here. How can we come together to make things safer?
Now, I know many organizations have layers of nursing involvement, committees. Many have what's called a shared governance. How can you use those types of structures to help promote safety and improve this fair and just culture we're trying to create?
Unit practice councils are a great example of shared governance. Here they are run by oncology nurses. They meet monthly with a set agenda with documented minutes and shared with all the nurses. And they take ownership of the issues that are important to them, and they come up with local solutions. The unit practice councils have support from leadership and can seek guidance on next steps where applicable. And there is usually greater buy-in when ideas come directly from the frontline staff.
I think you're absolutely right that any way that a nurse can make sure their voice is heard to impact change, especially at the front line of care, that directly impacts patients, I think that's all for the better. And certainly not all nurses maybe have capacity or have interest in doing that at all points in their career. But I think it's important to create those opportunities for nurses to participate and really feel like they are driving the improvement and the change of their own practice.
Right. And it gives them a sense of fulfillment in their role, because being a nurse and taking care of patients is so fulfilling. But if you are taking it a step further and really just improving the work environment or looking for ways to update policies or procedures or implement change, that can add a layer to that, as you mentioned.
Absolutely. And then you, again, bring back in the idea of burnout. This certainly can be a way for those nurses that feel like they don't have any power, they don't have any control, like being part of these types of committees and councils. For some nurses, give them that sense of satisfaction in their work because they do feel like they are helping to create solutions. And I think that can be very satisfying for nurses that, that is something that would make them more content in the work that they do. So what can oncology nurses as individuals or as teams do to create this culture when perhaps they don't have the administrative or leadership support that would ideally be there?
Oncology nurses are equipped with knowledge and skills to create this culture, so they can be familiar with current practices and standards of care for oncology patients and recommend changes if applicable. Oncology nurses can also participate in quality improvement projects, peer-to-peer education or re-education, and participate in applicable competencies on their units. And oncology nurses can also do team daily huddles at the beginning of their shifts to review their schedule for the day and perhaps any potential complications or safety issues that they may anticipate and come up with a plan.
I think as you've mentioned and I've listened as we've discussed, ideally it comes from the top down, correct? Like, you want the top of your leadership structure to support this, to be enthusiastic about this, to really make this an important key priority. And I think in a lot of large institutions or a lot of large health systems, that's typically what is seen. But there are a lot of smaller institutions out there, whether it's individual private practices, that it maybe isn't. Maybe they're just not in that same environment because they're not part of a larger health system. So I really appreciate you providing that information on how, even a grassroots approach where you kind of start from the bottom and you get together with your teammates and, maybe your supervisor or your shift lead to say, here are some concerns. How can we do things better? How can we talk about what's happening so that we can improve our safety or avoid these types of issues in the future? And, I think it's also important to recognize the different layers of leadership. And while even if your most proximal leader is supportive and encouraging, perhaps, they have a boss too. And so there's lots of layers, like an onion. And so it's always important that leaders are supported by their leaders. And it goes, like I said, all the way up to the C-suite and beyond. It's just important to consider that there can be challenges at all layers of that. And so just wanting to, provide support and encouragement for our leadership that might be listening to this episode is that it's a hard job. And sometimes they're not given the support that they need. So it's okay to scale it down to start with. If you can only start at a unit-based or a team-based, and then hopefully try to spread that fair and just culture throughout your institution or your organization, certainly is something to be looked at and proud of if you can accomplish that. But it's important that nurses know that they can do something, even if it's just them on their unit, on their shift. There's always something that can be done.
Absolutely. And I would like to add, I love the motto, if you see a problem, you can solve a problem. So no matter what level you fall on the clinical ladder or within your administration, you always have the opportunity to promote and create positive change and do that with the leadership support.
Well, Klara, I think we've touched on some really important topics today. It's something that I think all nurses know has to be front and center of their mind and of the million other things they're thinking about all the time. But I think we've provided some great ideas and tips of how they can potentially implement certain aspects of this fair and just culture and promoting patient safety on a regular basis. Klara, thank you so much for spending some time with us today and sharing information, your wisdom, and your experience on how we can help our oncology nurses better understand their power and their influence in creating a fair and just culture. As we approach the end of our episode, we like to always wrap up with a few of these quickfire questions. So to start things off, what are some common misconceptions about creating a fair and just culture?
A common misconception about creating a fair and just culture is that if people speak up or communicate issues, it is punitive. It's definitely not. The purpose of this is to eliminate preventable harm.
What is something about this topic of fair and just culture that's not often discussed, but you wish people knew more about?
So there are times where we do need to have some difficult conversations and provide transparency, and that is critical in these difficult conversations. So we do need to be sensitive to the individual or staff member that an event may have affected and ensure that when we are performing follow-up and debriefs, that we are doing so in good faith and to help prevent this from happening to other people.
What additional training or education do oncology nurses need to better understand and promote fair and just culture for safety?
Healthcare organizations should really conduct a culture of safety survey before implementation. So this helps to measure important dimensions of organizational culture. So that can include safety and teamwork culture, local leadership, learning systems, resilience and burnout, and work-life balance. Then the leaders need to review the results and share them with their oncology nursing team, because these results are critical for organizational improvement. So once you've established where your opportunities are to improve and implement this culture of safety, there should be formalized training for the nurses and the rest of the team. So that can include in-person or virtual in-services and an online learning module. And lastly, once a culture has been implemented on the unit, there should be repeat organizational assessments, perhaps maybe every 1 to 2 years, to review progress and sustain improvement.
I think of that, it reminds me of my CPR training and how we're doing more of this rapid quality improvement every quarter. If you only do it once every 2 years, how effective will you be? I think the same could be said for any of our safety interventions that we're trying to implement in our practice. If we're only talking about them once a year or once every other year, it's hard to really hardwire that. So I think those are some great recommendations. And finally, what are some additional resources for patients or providers that want to learn more?
So some resources for patients and providers who want to learn more, they can access the Joint Commission website, where there are many resources, but especially the Sentinel event alerts, which will really do a deep dive into culture of safety and major events that providers and patients can look at and learn from. Another website is the Patient Safety Network, which is an official website of the Department of Health and Human Services. And lastly, professional organizations such as the Oncology Nursing Society has many resources on creating and maintaining a culture of safety.
Klara, thank you again for spending time with us and sharing your information. Do you have any final comments for our listeners?
Yes, and thank you again, Jamie, for having me. This was great. Oncology nurses should feel empowered to advocate for patient and staff safety. Once an organization has established a just culture and leaders have demonstrated to their teams that they are somebody they can rely on, the rest of it really does fall into place. It is certainly hard work and dedication, but it is amazing to see oncology nurses and other members of the healthcare team start to speak up and contribute their ideas, concerns, and solutions. Respecting and valuing the input and contribution of all team members is at the heart of achieving high reliability.
Very well said. Thank you so much, Klara.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. Tell us about your favorite part in this episode by leaving a review wherever you download your podcast. For more resources and information about oncology nursing, visit us at ons.org or voice.ons.org. The ideas and opinions shared in this episode represent those of the guest and not necessarily ONS.